Internal Revenue Service IRS Tax News. Find a qualified tax professional using IRS website resources. IR 2020-139, July 6, 2020, Washington. With the federal income tax deadline just around the corner, the Internal Revenue Service wants to remind taxpayers that irs.gov, irs.gov, the IRS website, offers tax tips on finding a qualified tax professional. So the tax deadline typically for 2019 would have been around April 15th, but it was extended to July 15th. So July 15th is coming up now. So many people might be looking for tax professionals to help them out to fill out their tax returns. And you might want to look at the IRS website to see what their suggestions are related to picking a tax professional. Back to the text. Over 84 million tax returns were prepared by a paid return preparer last year. So many returns are going to be paid by the paid return preparers. And if you have a very simple return, then you may be able to do your return with your own software or something like that, to use some kind of software like an H&R Block software or a TurboTax type software from Intuit, the makers of QuickBooks, or you might be able to use free resources on the IRS website in that case. However, if your tax return gets more complex, then you may want to hire a tax professional at that point in time. And it usually happens when the income gets a bit higher, or that you plan for income to get higher in the future, or if you'd like some particular kind of tax advice along with the tax preparation, then it could be useful to bring on a tax professional for helping in that regards. Back to the text. Though most tax professionals provide honest, high-quality service, taxpayers should keep in mind these basic tips when selecting a tax professional. There's links to selecting a tax professional. Choose a trusted preparer. Taxpayers entrust vital personal data with the person preparing their tax return, including social security number and information on income and investments. So obviously when you're dealing with a tax professional, you're dealing with someone that's going to have access to some of your personal information, and it's possible for people to have that information to like sell it, right? To sell that personal information and have identity theft and that kind of stuff. So you want to make sure that you're dealing with someone that you trust. So you want to make sure you're dealing with a company that you trust, or possibly I would suggest going to an individual or a tax firm that you trust in that particular return that's being prepared, and possibly building a relationship in the future, because that's how you're going to build trust over time, because you'll have a future investment going in place. In other words, if you're looking to have your tax return prepared, and it's the first time you've had it prepared or if you've had it prepared by other firms in the past, instead of looking for like a one-time preparation process, even if it's a fairly basic return, you might want to look for a tax professional that you want to build a relationship with in the future, so they can prepare future returns and hopefully grow with you as you grow. As the economy gets better, hopefully you make more money and things get better, your life gets better and more complex, most likely. And then you want a tax professional that might be able to help you grow with that as well. And if that is the case, then you have a future invested interest as well with the tax return, and they have one in you, and that helps to build a relationship and build trust, because there's kind of two components with the trust here. One is that you want to make sure you're working with someone that's honest, a firm that's honest, and you might be able to do that by working with like a large company to make sure that that's an honest, company to some degree. But then if you work with a large company, you're probably working with many more individuals that might rotate in and out of that company more quickly. So you might not be building as much of a personal relationship with the actual individuals, but they probably have safeguards in place to protect the information to some degree. And then you want to basically, the other thing with trust is that you want to be building a relationship. If you build a more long-term relationship, they're more likely not only not to do something dishonest with the information like sell it, but they're likely to be more efficient, or work better, or put the tax return together and with more care, given the fact that you have a future investment with them. So I would put your time into the future investment. Also, if you're thinking about tax planning either now or in the future, then you might want to be thinking about a firm that has the capacity not simply to just put together the tax return, but gives you a little bit more advice on tax preparation or tax advice, going forward, tax projection type advice. Back to the text. Review the tax return carefully before signing. Taxpayers are legally responsible for what's on their tax return regardless of whether someone else prepared it. If something does not look right, don't hesitate to ask questions. So if there's a problem with the tax return, the IRS will principally go back to the taxpayer, the one that prepared the return. I mean, the idea of the tax return is that the individual is going to report their taxes to the IRS, sign off that the taxes are correct. The individual basically being the one then responsible. Now, obviously, the individual then hires someone to help them out with the preparation of the tax return, and in doing so, it can be easy to start to think, well, the tax preparer is the one's responsible, right? That's what the individual starts to think sometimes, right? The tax return preparer is the one that did it. I'm not the one that prepared the return, and therefore I'm not liable for any problems on the return. That's not the way it works, right? The IRS is going to say, you signed off on the return, you hired them to prepare your return, and so the one that they're principally going to go after or ask questions about is going to be the tax preparer, the one that prepared the return. So you want to make sure that you have someone preparing the return that prepares it honestly, and you want to review the return. And even if you don't know everything, every line item on the return, you can check the big numbers, and you can at least verify the adjusted gross income and the major components of the tax return. And if anything looks funny, you want to ask questions about it. Now, remember, the IRS also has 3 years to normally come back with an audit, and they could just randomly pick an audit. There might not even be anything wrong. They might randomly pick an audit, and if there's something further wrong with it, or if it's over a certain level of error in the IRS's judgment, they have longer than 3 years to come back to it. And that's another reason you might want to build a relationship that's a little bit longer term with a tax preparer. It'd be nice if they came back 3 years later and asked about your return, that you can go back to the tax preparer that you have a relationship with and ask about the issue at that point in time. So back to the text. Make sure the preparer signs the return and includes their preparer tax identification number, P10. So if you have a paid tax preparer, the IRS does track who prepares the tax return as well as the person whose tax return is being prepared. They're doing that more and more and tracking that as well, so that you do want to make sure that if you are having a paid tax preparer, that they are including their information that's required as a paid tax preparer, including the preparer tax identification number. So the IRS obviously thinks of the tax preparer as a number, social security number, tax identification number, and they think of the preparer as a number, the P10, the preparer tax identification number. Both should be identified on the tax return if you're paying someone to prepare the tax return. So never sign a blank tax return. Consider it a red flag when a taxpayer is asked to sign a blank tax return. So that just shouldn't happen. A tax preparer shouldn't be asking someone to sign a tax return before it's prepared, because obviously you're supposed to review the tax return after the numbers have been filled out on it. The only reason I can think of that someone would do that, other than a scam, is to say that it's going to be something that's going to be easier or faster to do. You sign the tax return first, then I'll fill it out and send it in, and you don't have to, that's it. We don't have to converse anymore. But at this point in time, it should be pretty easy to do the signature process, especially if you have electronic resources. The tax returns most of the time will be helped along with software. And much of the software has e-file type of verification process. So the signature process and the verification, typically if you have that e-file or the e-sign type of software, should be pretty easy these days. So it shouldn't be too cumbersome of a task to review and sign the tax return. It's not like you're doing it by mail or even have to possibly even go to the office anymore or drop off the return. So really not a reason there's no reason at this point, it seems to me, for even one having to try to justify having a blank tax return. But in any case, if anyone tells you to sign anything before it's filled out, I wouldn't do that. Back to the text. Ask about service fees. Avoid preparers who base fees on percentage of their client's refund or boast bigger refunds than their competition. So you're just not supposed to do that. Tax preparers aren't supposed to basically make their fee contingent on the amount of the refund. And the reason is because the IRS is worried, and they're rightly so, that the tax preparers would then have an incentive to do things that are more aggressive than otherwise, right? They're going to take aggressive stances in order to get the refund. And you might think, well, that's great. That's what I'm paying for. That's why I'm doing it. But note, if they're more likely to take aggressive stances and then be gone, when you get an audit or something like that. So that's the tax preparers that are extremely aggressive. If they run into problems, the question is, where are you going to be? If there's a problem with this aggressive stance that was taken, so you want to make sure that if they're boasting like larger refunds than anybody else, then again, how are they generating those larger refunds? They're probably taking, they're doing something, aggressive and possibly not legal. And you also want to think about the firm's, the longevity of the firm. How long has that firm basically been there? If they've been there for a longer period of time, you're more likely that they're going to be a solid firm. If there's someone that came in out of nowhere, and they're selling returns that have promised for a big refund, and you haven't seen them ever before, and no one else has ever heard of them, and they might be gone, next year. So you want to make sure that you really want someone that's going to fill out the return properly. So someone that should be boasting, I'm going to fill out the return properly and save as much money to the best of my abilities within the law, within the tax law, and that's going to be different for every tax payer that's going to be involved in it. Okay, so back to the text. Taxpayers can use several options to help find a tax preparer. One resource is choosing a tax professional. There's a link to that here, which includes a wealth of consumer guidance for selecting a tax professional. There are various types of tax return preparers, including enrolled agents, certified public accountants, attorneys, and some who don't have a professional credential. So when you think about, what type of return preparer do you want someone that's focusing simply on that their main focus is tax preparation, and that's what they have studied most. And the enrolled agent is gonna typically kind of fall into that area because the requirements for the enrolled agents are more tied strictly to processing tax return and dealing with the IRS. A certified public accountant, and that's going to expand the window a bit because a certified public accountant will be helping with tax professional, but they may be, they've been trained in other just general accounting information as well, so they might be able to help out with bookkeeping and other things that will be involved. And then attorneys can act have practiced, again, in more broader kind of thing, have acted as basically agents in that regard, and attorneys and CPAs and enrolled agents, if you want someone to help you out with basically discussing with the IRS kind of problems for you, acting as an agent with regards to the IRS. That's another thing that you can consider with regards to the choices you're making there. Oftentimes, if you're talking about attorneys and whatnot, you may have a specific type of thing that you're mainly concerned with, and the attorney might have a specialization in that kind of area, because attorney is going to be fairly broad. Even accountants, a certified public accountant is fairly, that's a pretty broad thing. So then the question is, are they specializing in taxation or is the firm having tax and or bookkeeping, which might be closer to what many people are kind of looking for if they're doing tax preparation. That goes well with questions about bookkeeping and that kind of thing as well. The enrolled agents are typically going to be focused more on not normal, just broader accounting, but on tax topics there. So back to the text. The Directory of Federal Tax Return Preparers with Credentials and Select Qualifications, there's a link to that here, is a free, searchable, and sortable database. It includes the name, city, state, and zip code of credentialed return preparers for preparers who are CPAs, enrolled agents, or attorneys, as well as those who have completed the requirements for the IRS annual filing season program. There's a link to that here. A search of the database can help taxpayers verify credentials and qualifications of tax professionals or locate a tax professional in their geographic area. The IRS requires anyone who prepares any federal tax return for compensation to have a P10 PTIN. For 2020, the IRS has issued more than 773,000 P10s. There is also a page with IRS Tax Pro Association partners. There's a link to that here that includes links to national nonprofit tax professional groups that can help taxpayers seek the right type of qualified help. There's a link to that here from a tax preparer. More resources are below. We got links to those resources here. There'll be a link to this in the description.